and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. The last time I spoke to people, it was in front of a couple of thousand people in person, so it's a bit strange to be back in front of a camera again, but I'm very, very pleased that you joined us. So as Adam said, today's topic is all about how we manage the kind of difficult conversations around price and supply, and especially so in the face of the impending recession, at least in some countries. So there are four areas that we're going to cover today over the next hour or so, starting with just a little bit of background on what's going on right now with supply chains and inflation and what that means for you if you're a sales leader or a member of a sales team. Then we'll talk about how the mindset that you have, especially going into the next 12 months. I mean, we've all developed a pretty robust mindset over the last 3 years or so, but I think we're going to need it even more going forward. So we'll talk a bit about the 3D mindset, then focusing in on how you handle some of these more difficult conversations with clients, whether you know them well or not. And then finally, and perhaps the kind of most important part of this, is talking about how you negotiate a price increase without breaking trust and without losing the relationship that you've built up. So without any further ado, let's talk about supply chains, inflation, and sales. Now, it won't come as a great surprise to many of you that you're under a lot of pressure from three different sources at the moment. So the first is there are clearly supply constraints and supply chain disruption. Some of that's come from the pandemic. Some of that's come from the war in Ukraine and the impact that's had on energy, and also the supply of different raw materials like grain and lithium and other things like that, and also labor disruption, which is kind of patchy but creating issues with supply chains across the world. And then the second effect is increasing wages. So again, that's been driven in part by the pandemic and in part by labor market friction, by which I mean different parts of the economy right now are growing at different speeds, but the mobility of staff from one part of the economy to another makes it difficult for the market to balance itself out. Plus, of course, you have the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and all of the other factors that are affecting the workplace right now. So what that's meaning is that wages are going up. And of course, as the cost of living goes up, so people also want increase in their salaries. The third element is, at the moment, high demand relative to supply. So the kind of supply constraint is creating supply push inflation by pushing up the cost of raw materials. The other aspect of it is high demand, certainly in some sectors, that is creating demand pull inflation by creating an imbalance again between demand and supply. So that happened as the pandemic eased and suppressed demand expanded in some sectors. It's created in part by the surge in e-commerce, and as I say, it's very, very variable by sector. So all three of those effects are driving increased prices, partly because demand is exceeding supply and people are using price as a rationing tool, and partly just because costs are going up. Now, what that means is that as salespeople, we are getting a number of different conversations with customers. The first one is, supply constraints mean you're letting me down. So these are the difficult conversations about, I know you want this, but we can't get it to you for 3 months, or it's delayed, or whatever it might be. At the same time, you're trying to ask for a price increase. So the customer's going, well, you can't do what I want, and now you want to increase my prices. And I think compared to the first time we ran this webinar a few months ago, most people get that inflation is here. And so that pressure against price increases is a bit less, but it's still there because people are saying, I can't necessarily pass my costs on to my customers. But then also, while we have kind of demand growing in certain areas, companies are saying, I want you to help me grow my business. I need you to supply this. I need you to help me drive innovation, to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So we've got these three different conversations that are going on, and it's quite hard to balance them. It's quite hard to be having a positive forward-looking conversation while at the same time asking for a price increase and explaining why you can't deliver. But if that wasn't enough, there's something else that, as we know, is potentially going to happen. I say potentially because it's not certain. The policy response to what's going on right now is, of course, raising interest rates and fiscal tightening. So we're trying to dampen down the economy and reduce the effects of inflation. That is a bit problematic, though, because inflation at the moment is not entirely driven by the buoyancy in the economy. It's also driven by, as we've said, supply constraints and supply chain issues, and of course, unavailability of certain commodities and the increased price of energy. So what that means is there is a risk that we end up with, instead of high demand, with falling demand linked to consistently increasing prices, and that gives you stagflation, the combination of stagnation and inflation. Now, there are some signs that we might avoid this. I think certainly in the UK, we're probably going to go into recession over the next year or so. But the risk is that you get inflation mixed with a decrease in demand, and that becomes very difficult, as those who, as I was, were alive in the 70s will remember. So here, the conversation with the customer is, you're still letting me down because there are still supply chain challenges. I understand by now that prices are going up, but I can't pay more. And in terms of demand, our needs have changed. Our priorities have changed. We no longer require this level of product or service, but we now need this instead, or we need it next year. So all of these conversations are quite difficult, and we still need to be able to manage the pricing conversation, because price is such a vastly powerful lever for your profits. As I was saying to a large company a couple of weeks ago, you know, a 5% increase in price can easily lead to a 25% increase in your net earnings, and the reverse is also true. So the other problem we have is volatility, and volatility happens because down a supply chain, when one part of the demand equation changes, that change can be amplified along the industry. So let's take a very simple example. We have a customer who makes a change in the number of units they buy. So there's a small increase in demand at the customer side. And the distributor goes, okay, demand has increased, but also their stocks will have gone down, their inventory's gone down because they've sold more. So they see increased demand, they see reduced stocks, and there's a tendency to overcompensate, to buy too much. Now you do that, and then there's a lag before the product arrives, especially at the moment. And many systems are not taking full account of the lag that there is now in the system. So that lag happens, and then suddenly all this new product arrives and you've got too much stock. So you see this kind of whip effect where there's over-ordering to begin with, then under-ordering. Now, the distributor is buying from a wholesaler, and so the effect on the wholesaler is similar, but even more pronounced. There's massive over-ordering, especially if there's bulk purchasing discounts that encourage that sort of behavior. And then the distributor goes, oh no, I've got way too much stock, and then they massively under-order. And if you feed that through to the manufacturer, it can cause huge over-manufacture, and actually ultimately can push somebody out of business, not least because of the cash flow implications of the over-manufacture and then the sudden drop in demand from their wholesalers. So there is an increase in volatility as well as the likely decrease in demand and increase in prices. Now, when you think about what buyers, what your customers are doing in response to those problems, those of you who are familiar with Imparta know that we are very buyer-centric in the way we think about selling. So selling is essentially a process of facilitating the customer's buying journey or buying cycle. And that cycle begins with them deciding they have a need, either independently or because you've intervened, choosing the best solution, worrying about what might go wrong, committing to that solution, adopting it, and then renewing and or expanding it. And if stagflation happens, and even if it's just a common or garden variety recession, buying behavior will change. So needs and priorities change, and with demand will become more volatile. It becomes harder to create value because your prices are going up and their needs change. At the choose level, decision criteria have changed massively over the last couple of years. You know, things like supply resilience are much more important, you know, guarantees on prices, that kind of thing. And those criteria will continue to change the way that customers choose between your products and services and those of somebody else. At the worry stage, the risk appetite has changed and will continue to change. So what tends to happen is the payback horizon that customers are willing to accept becomes much shorter when times are difficult, and especially when inflation is happening. So you've got kind of maybe 18 months decision cycle, a payback period that people were thinking about a few years ago, and that may be 6 months now that people are looking for a return on their investment. Commit, the hurdle rate, as I say, has increased both in terms of the payback period shortening, and the percentage people are looking for has gone up. And then demonstrating ROI becomes even more critical in the adopt and the renew stage. So all of those things are happening, but also decisions are slowing down. More people are getting involved, more people are bringing in additional stakeholders to protect themselves politically, and in some cases, those decisions even fall off completely and disappear. So there's a lot of stalled deals around right now. So let me ask you a question. And Adam mentioned Slido, which is a tool that we use on these webinars just to kind of keep it interactive. If you point your camera, if you've not already done that, on your phone at the QR code there, it will just take you to the page on Slido, which is a robust third-party app. And let me ask you, which of these issues have you already seen? Needs and priorities changing, decision criteria changing, risk appetite changing, hurdle rates increasing for investment, and ROI becoming even more important. So if you go to that page, you should be able to put that in. You can choose more than one. Looks like somebody's had most of those. And let's see what, as a group, as a community here today on this call, we have 123 people on the call today, 1, 2, 3. And we will see what you guys are experiencing. So 80% are seeing needs and priorities changing. That is, if that's not a significant proportion, I don't know what is. Half of you are seeing decision criteria changing. A third are seeing the risk appetite changing. And about a fifth, the ROI is becoming even more important and hurdle rates are increasing. Interesting that the hurdle rate increase hasn't really bitten yet by the look of it, but my prediction would be that that becomes even more critical as things go forward, because interest rates going up pushes up the weighted average cost of capital for most of your customers, and therefore they'll be thinking very differently about the investments that they make. So I think we can agree that pretty much all of these are real issues, some more than others, and needs and priorities changing and decision criteria changing seems to be the two most pressing issues for you guys at the moment. Thank you very much for completing that. So how can we manage the impact of these disruptions and of inflation at each stage of the buying cycle? And there are a few things that we can do. So at the need stage, we can not just respond to demand, but we can anticipate it and try to shape it. And I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail in a second. At the choose stage, we can understand what those new decision criteria are and help to work on them. At the worry stage, we can identify new risks and help to alleviate them. In the commit stage, understand the negotiation interests both of our business and of our customers have shifted, and take account of that in the way that we negotiate in order to create value. In the adoption phase, there may well be difficult conversations because of supply chain issues. We need to be able to manage those well. And at the renewal stage, being able to seek price increases at the renewal stage is especially delicate because you want people to renew, obviously, but you also need to achieve the right margin for the business. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. But there is one other thing that does help you, just to give you a little bit of good news here. And that's something called status quo bias. So it's harder to win new business from new logos when the market is very turbulent, because people have a tendency when things are difficult to want to stay with the status quo, with their current suppliers. And that's because of a number of factors. One is psychological inertia, just people don't want to change. There's loss aversion. So people anticipate what might go wrong if they shift away from an existing supplier. And that loss aversion is quite a strong motivator of change, or of not changing in this case. There's something called the endowment effect, which means psychologically that people value something more if they already own it, has been shown by a number of research studies over the years. So the fact that they already have your product and service means that they actually they value it more than a competitive offering. There is a counterpoint to that, which is that people's expectations will tend to increase over time, which you need to be aware of. But the endowment effect can help you, as can the decision costs associated with switching. So somebody having to go through a whole retendering process, deal with the uncertainty that creates. Generally, procurement won't worry about that because that's their job, but the line managers who actually use your products and services will. So as things get more difficult in the environment outside the business, all of those effects get bigger, and so the status quo bias, the tendency to stay where they are and play safe, will increase. And so you can hopefully take advantage of that with your existing customers. So when we talk about need and anticipating and shaping demand, anticipating demand is all about considering how changes in the customer's environment might affect the deal size of the work you're doing, and to anticipate that in advance so you can help your own business to plan capacity. When you're asking for when a deal might happen, don't just ask for a date, but ask for a range of dates, because timing is just as critical as level of demand. And when you're thinking about the CRM, a lot of people in the probability field of an entry and opportunity in the CRM will just put the probability of that revenue happening. But you have to think about the probability of that revenue happening in this period. And if you think it might be in next year or next financial year, it may be worth putting in a balancing entry into next year with, you know, the remaining probability, so that you accurately reflect when that revenue is going to happen, not just whether it will. And then the other thing is to collaborate with the customer, get stuck in with their operations teams and try and forward plan demand for their benefit as well as for your own. But then you can also try and shape that demand. So if you have substitute products and services with greater supply resilience, then maybe you try and suggest those as an alternative. If prices are rising, you might help them to re-engineer and introduce lower cost products and services. Seek forward orders, give yourself predictability and give them lower price. So that's essentially a negotiation. And if you can, try to align their demand with quiet times in your own production facilities or service teams or whatever it is. So just a few ideas there, but you can also think of many others around how you can anticipate and shape the demand of your customers to make the impact on your business less. In terms of decision criteria, one of our kind of favorite tools is the value map, which helps you to understand your position in a competitive pitch. So you take all the different things that the customer is going to measure you against, whether it's price or service level or relationship or payment terms, whatever it might be, and you ask how important is each of these relatively to the customer, and how do they perceive our performance? Is it better or worse than the alternatives they're considering? And then you plot your criteria or their criteria on this grid, and you have things that are worse than the alternatives, but they really care about, which are the value killers. The value winners are the things that they perform better at, and that are very important, you perform better at and are very important to them. And things that are called value sleepers are where you perform well, but they don't care. And you can maybe help them to see how important those criteria are. So plot all of the different criteria. Here's just a handful, but recognize that when there's a recession, when there's inflation, the priority, as well as some of the actual criteria, might change dramatically. So don't assume that people will rebuy your product or service, because it may be that now their priorities have changed and somebody else's now looks more attractive. So you've got to get back in there and understand how their decision criteria have shifted and whether their priorities have shifted as well. In terms of risk, there are basically three approaches to alleviating risk once you've managed to uncover it. And essentially the three approaches are: you can correct any misperceptions that may exist. So for example, if there's a risk that's now perceived around supply chain reliability, you can demonstrate your track record, you can provide references and explain how wonderfully redundant your supply chain now is. You can reduce the likelihood of something going wrong. For example, forecasting ahead, creating redundancy in the system, holding extra stock, very regular reforecasting and redesigning the product or service to increase resilience, as examples. Or you can try and reduce the impact if something does go wrong. So you can talk to the customer and go, well, we can provide a backup supplier. There are substitutes you could use if we can't supply. We can mitigate the differences in the product spec between what we have and what we don't have, and create other contingency plans. So you're not a spectator where risk is concerned. Come up with active steps to mitigate and alleviate those risks. And then in the commit stage, I talked about the negotiation. In negotiation, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on, there are lots of different things you're trying to do, but fundamentally you're trying to capture value that's been created, but also to create new value through the negotiation. And you do that by trading off negotiating interests that you care about for things that the customer cares about. And the more negotiation interests you have on the table, the better you are going to be able to do that. So here's some of the things that you would typically consider. You know, the structuring of the payment, is it CapEx or OpEx, contract terms, updates, referrals, support hours, payment terms, recurring revenue especially. But in this new environment, think about all of the new factors, the new negotiating interests that become relevant. So you have things like supply chain support, delivery time. SLAs become even more critical. Inflation-linked price increases might be something that you want. Warranties and remedies, deferred payments if somebody's in trouble. All of these and many others that you can think of will become relevant. So in a negotiation, it's really important to think through and work with your finance teams to go, what do we care about? Do we care more about profit or cash right now, or growth or stability? And ask the same question of the customer. So we will cover the next two things in a bit more detail in the rest of the program. So managing difficult conversations, which often happens at the adopt stage, but can happen during the sale, we'll talk about next. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll talk about seeking price increases if required. I did want just to touch, though, first on mindset. As I mentioned, we've been through a very tumultuous time, and it's not getting any better immediately, that's for sure. And so when we talk about the way that salespeople can perform to their best in these environments, we've developed a concept called the 3D mindset. And to kind of explain what that is, I'd like to ask you a question. Think about a difficult conversation you've had with a customer or a colleague and why it happened. So this is just in the context of having a difficult conversation. Why did that happen? And if you wouldn't mind going to Slido and just typing in, you know, a couple of words or a brief sentence, or even just one word to explain why that difficult conversation happened in the first place. Whatever the reason, and it's anonymous this, so nobody will know. Different perceptions, fear, supply, delayed delivery, yep. Issues with delivered quality, one or both parties are under pressure, price increase. So in a word cloud, obviously that's the one that most people have put down. Disconnected expectations, different perceptions, frustration with a colleague. Now there's one here I want to pick out because it's interesting for a number of reasons. You see in the middle there, it says took eye off the ball. And there's a big difference between that one and most of the rest of the reasons that were given here. And the difference is as follows. That one is about the person who wrote it. It's something that they are taking responsibility for, whereas quite a lot of the others are external reasons why a difficult conversation happened. Now, I'm not saying that any of these things are wrong, because clearly this is what happened, but the internal language that we use to explain what's happening in our world as salespeople actually has a really big impact on the way we deal with those situations, according to our research. So there is thank you very much for doing that, by the way. There is there's a psychological framework called the locus of control. And what this is a spectrum from internal locus of control to external locus of control. And everybody generally has a sort of preference point on that spectrum somewhere. People who are very internally focused in terms of their locus of control believe that outcomes are within their control and driven by their actions. If, on the other hand, you have a very external locus of control, you believe implicitly that outcomes tend to be outside your control and are driven by others, the market, your boss, the customer, Putin, all of those external factors, right? Now, there's no right or wrong here, but what research showed was that people who tend to have a more internal locus of control, so rather than saying the market was, was disrupted, instead they would go, I didn't anticipate the market disruption enough and manage expectations early enough, right? So they're framing problems not as something that's happening to them, but in such a way as they can actually do something about it. And again, our research showed that people with the same level of skill, but who had an internal locus of control, tended to perform much, much better than people who had an external locus of control. So my advice here is think about your internal language. And if you find yourself often externalizing the reasons, again, it's not wrong, but it may not be the most helpful framing to give yourself. Instead, try to take responsibility where it's appropriate and go, what could I have done to predict, to manage, to mitigate what's happening? So responsibility is the first part of the 3D mindset. The second part is resilience, and resilience is important. It's especially important when you're asking for a price increase, because that is quite a stressful process. And actually, stress is something that procurement experts are trained to give you. They're there to make you feel stressed so that you back off your request for a price increase. And so there are many sources of stress. Your own perceived lack of skill in a negotiation, the importance of the outcome. People know how important these price increases are. If you've not prepared thoroughly, that can create stress. Not agreeing with the action in the first place. Maybe you think we shouldn't ask for a price increase. And engineered discomfort. So the procurement team putting you under time pressure, telling you that all of your competitors can do the same thing for much less. So all of these sources of stress kind of feed into the bucket of stress that we all carry around with us. And the best way to be resilient is to find ways to tap out that stress and to reduce it, knowing that it's going to keep getting filled up. So you can prepare, right, to reduce the amount of stress that you feel. You can treat it as a challenge instead of as a threat. And actually, the research shows that treating a negotiation as a challenge instead of as a threat, almost like a problem or a puzzle to be solved, is one of the best ways to de-stress the situation and allow yourself to think calmly and in a structured way. Listen and collaborate. The easiest way if you're under pressure is just to stop talking, stop trying to solve the problem, and work with somebody and just listen carefully. Equally, if you need to, take time out. Recognize, and this was something that the great heroes of negotiation, Fisher and Ury, said in their book, Getting to Yes, I think it was about 30 years ago, focus on the problem, not the people. Don't hate the person you're negotiating with. They're just doing their job. Focus on the problem and solve it together. And finally, it can be very helpful if you're trying to build your resilience to score a small yes. Just get an agreement and kind of celebrate that and just go, it's a small step, but it's a positive one. So the second part of the 3D mindset is resilience and all of the things you can do to try and reduce your own stress and build your resilience, especially in a negotiation. And the third element is rigor. So we have responsibility, resilience, and rigor. And the problem with any kind of sales activity is that there is a non-linear return between the skill and effort you put in and the results you achieve. So if you are, for example, pitching for a new piece of business or asking for a price increase, up to a certain point of skill and effort, you're not going to achieve anything. And it's only once you put in enough to overcome the barriers, suddenly you break through and you win the deal or you get the price increases. So it's important to be rigorous and to go the extra mile. It's difficult when we're all busy and stressed, but going the extra mile is critical. Dave Brailsford, the GB cycling coach, called it the aggregation of marginal gains. It's not about doing one thing 10 times better. It's about doing 1,000 things a tiny bit better. So resilience, responsibility, and rigor. Okay, so let's move on. Any questions at this point? We're about halfway through. Let me just pause and see if there's any questions before we talk about handling difficult conversations. You can pop them. I'll check on Slido in a bit. You can pop them into the chat box or the Q&A box. Nothing on your side, Adam?
No, nothing I can see here.
Okay. Right, let's talk about handling difficult conversations. So when you're going to have a conversation with somebody that's difficult, the chances are that they will feel quite a bit of tension coming into that conversation, and trust might be relatively low. So tension about the problem, and even about having the conversation with you. People tend not to like conflict, and trust in you and in your ability to help and even in your organization might be low. So one of the things you have to do in a difficult conversation is to bring tension down quickly and increase the level of trust quickly in order to allow a more meaningful and less emotive conversation to happen. So one of the ways to do that is to understand what it is that customers are looking for. And our research into what customers do want in the context of a difficult conversation in a service environment was that they actually want justice. But justice is not a single type of justice. There are actually 3 types of justice that we found that customers are looking for in a conversation. And they're looking for them in roughly equal proportion. Roughly a third want each type of justice. And I think this is really interesting, right? So the first type of justice is value justice. They want you to compensate them or to provide a solution with the right value. And they also want you to admit when you're wrong. So it's all about a value transaction. You've caused me a loss. I want you to compensate me for that loss. The second type of justice is interaction justice, where the customer is less concerned about the compensation, is more concerned about how well you listen, how well you understand their problem, and how well you resolve it. So how well are you interacting with them? And then the third and final type is process justice. So this is where a customer wants you to uncover the root cause of what's gone wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. Now, everybody wants all of these things, but we found that there are dominant types. And so understanding the language that these different types of justice tend to use, the people who want it, helps you to figure out where you should focus in terms of handling a difficult conversation with a particular customer. So for value justice, people will say things like, I just want a fair solution. It's not fair what's been done. It's not fair that somebody else has had their router or switch or polymer and I haven't. So you've got to take ownership of the issue in that case, provide knowledgeable answers, don't lie to make them feel better, but provide an explanation that's clear and simple of what has to be done. And if you can, offer compensation, because value justice cares about the loss, and make it worth the effort of making you aware of the issue. If somebody is looking for interaction justice, they'll tend to say things like, I don't feel good. You don't make me feel good. I'm not happy with this. And here your job is to make the customer feel better about the problem. So you're reassuring them, be patient, show respect, apologize. Apologies are okay. Try to show empathy rather than sympathy. So don't say, I'll mention this again in a second, but don't say, I'm really, that's awful, how bad for you, but go, I understand how that must feel, and be friendly and polite. Then process justice will be saying things like, I don't want this to happen again. How do you make sure this doesn't recur? And so there you've got to solve the problem fairly and efficiently, but figure out what the root cause is and let the customer know what you're doing to make sure it won't happen. And also make sure you hand off, if you have to hand off to a customer service team or something, make sure that they get the full picture so that they are following through in the right way to solve the problem. One of the other ways to reduce tension quickly and to build trust quickly is to do something that we call the AAA opening. And let's take the example of if the customer's called you first. So you begin with asking. You want to diffuse tension by asking a question quickly and letting them say something. So, hello, if you know who they are, hello, so-and-so, how can I help? And that lets them kind of start talking quickly. Then you acknowledge. So people want to feel heard psychologically. And so if you can acknowledge what they've been through, again, in the context of a difficult conversation, then that will help to reduce tension and build trust that you're there for them, not just on your own agenda. So I can hear that's concerning for you. Sounds like something we should sort out. Do you have time to discuss it right now? It's good to acknowledge people, their time is valuable as well. And then the final A is assure. So summarize the problem and assure people that you're here for them and you'll do what you can to help. You don't have to assure them the impossible, that you'll get their product tomorrow, but you assure them that you're there to help. And that leads into questions and more diagnosis. Now, that's if they call you. If you're calling somebody to tell them bad news, like your product's been delayed, the same three things happen. So if you call them, the ask is, do you have a moment to speak? The acknowledge is, I know you're busy. I know your time is valuable. I'm calling to discuss a supply chain issue. Do you have 15 minutes? And assure is, assure them again that you're here to help. So I've got some options that might be possible. Going back to the examples I gave before, maybe you can re-engineer to use a different product. Maybe you can upgrade them and pay some of the upgrade cost to a product that is available out of a different budget, and so on. Okay. So the AAA opening is a good way to diffuse tension and build trust at the beginning of a conversation. I talked about empathy versus sympathy earlier. Sympathy tends to create slightly more aggressive reactions in people than empathy. Empathy puts you literally on the same side of the table, not literally, but figuratively, whereas sympathy puts you on opposite sides. So rather than saying, you feel sorry for somebody, feel sorry with somebody. So don't say, that's awful, I'm really sorry, but say, thanks for sharing that. I would feel the same way. Don't say, I'm so sorry you've gone through that, but say, I understand what you're going through. Don't say that must be a very frustrating experience, but say, I've had that too. I know how frustrating it feels. So you're trying to kind of connect with the customer rather than just be somebody who's holding them at an arm's length. So those are just a couple of skills. There are a number of different skills you can use to handle a difficult conversation. Obviously, this is part of our curriculum. So the mindset is important. The AAA opening we talked about, empathy we talked about. There are different questions you can ask to help the customer to tell their story, the situation, the impact it's had on them, the priorities they have for a solution, whether the solution is right. Justice we've talked about, the language you use, whether it's positive or negative, makes a difference. There is a thing called single option aversion, which means that if you offer somebody one solution to a problem, or indeed one solution to their need, they're less likely to say yes than if you give them a choice. And finally, the way you frame this, the way that you steer the conversation to be on their agenda rather than all about the customer's, your own products and services, is very important. So in a webinar, we can only cover a few of these, and there's no chance to practice it, I'm afraid. But hopefully that's helpful in thinking about how you manage difficult conversations. And so let us move on and talk about asking for a price increase, the kind of the heart of this, in a sense, because you need to get the conversation. If you're going to ask for a price increase, you need to manage those emotions and get tension down and trust up before you can even talk about this, right? You don't want to go here when people are still really het up about not having something delivered. So when you're asking for price increases right now, I'm guessing you're hearing things a bit like this. You're taking advantage of the situation. You're greedy. I haven't got the budget. My CEO won't agree. You're delivering this remotely, so prices should be going down, not up. Or, we understand there's inflation. We can live with an increase, but not that much. So all of these things are very common. I think, again, people probably compared to 3 months ago get this. They understand that inflation is here. It is coming down in some parts of the world, but still there's resistance to accepting a price increase. one thing I would say to you and to your teams is that you're not alone, right? Your customer will be saying exactly the same thing to all of their suppliers. So don't allow this to stress you out. This is what people do when they're asked for a price increase, and it's completely common. And they don't dislike you because you're the only person doing it. You're not. So price increase is a very specific form of negotiation. And like all negotiation, it is a game of two halves. And I think a lot of where negotiation training has gone wrong in the past is it's focused on one or other of these two aspects, but not both. So on the one hand, if you think about value, the value created by a deal is the benefits to the customer minus the costs to you as the supplier for producing the product or service. So value is benefits minus costs. Now, the thing that decides how that value is split between the customer and the supplier is the price, right? So in a very simple example, the customer gets the benefits minus the price, and you, the supplier, get the price minus the costs. And so capturing value is one form of negotiation. It's using negotiation tactics to move the price or other terms in a win-lose way. I win, you lose. And so we're trying to split the pie differently. We're trying to increase the share of that value that we get. The benefits don't change, the costs don't change. We're just talking about price to split the pie. But there is also a form of negotiation that's all about creating value. And creating value is about either making the costs lower or making the benefits to the customer higher so that the total value pie increases. And this is very much a win-win type of negotiation. And the very best negotiation happens when you do both of these together. And we call it big win, little win negotiation. It's win-win, but you're just winning a little bit more than the other side. So everybody's happy, you're just a little bit happier than they are. That's the goal of good negotiation, especially if it's not a one-off and you're going to be having multiple rounds of negotiation with the same customer over many years, and you want to protect trust and build the relationship. So even when you're looking for a price increase, you can use big win, little win to make it more acceptable. So let's talk about the capture side, the win-lose aspect of that first. And you may be aware of a term in negotiation, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BATNA. And the BATNA is basically what determines the walkaway price that either side has. If my best alternative to negotiating with you is more attractive than the deal that's on the table, then I'll go. And same is true for the supplier and for the customer. Now think about, in the context of a price increase, what is the customer's real BATNA? What's their best alternative to saying yes to the price increase? And the thing is that there are actually many costs involved in switching to a different supplier. Think about things like the cost of rejigging all of the processes, the cost of going through the retendering process. I'll list them out in a second. So they actually have a relatively poor best alternative. They don't really want to switch. Their best alternative is probably to stick with you and pay the price increase. But they often want you to think that their best alternative is really strong. So they will say things like, your competitors are much cheaper, they can do the same thing, it won't cost us anything to switch. And so you have to form your own view of what their best alternative to agreeing the price increase is. That's not easy, but it is doable if you're rigorous enough to actually think it through. And my advice is, unless you've really damaged trust, accepting a price increase is often their best option, especially, and I credit this observation to my friend Jonas Olsen, who was the chief procurement officer at Trelleborg. And I did a speech with him not long ago on this topic. And his point was that the more frequently and smaller you do price increases, the less likely it is to trigger a retender process, because it's always not worth them going that extra mile, as long as the price increases you're asking for aren't too big. And so on the cost side of switching to their alternative are things like the increased personal effort and stress. Cost doesn't have to be financial only. Political opposition from people who like working with you, increased risk of a new supplier, reconfiguring products and services, the time and cost of reprocurement, the loss of relationships, the loss of what made them choose you in the first place, right? Your distinctive capabilities, your differentiated value. And against all of those costs, you just have to put the cost of the extra price. And unless you're asking for a very big price increase, in which case, do it in 6 monthly stages and make it smaller, it's unlikely that they're going to kind of outweigh all of those costs of switching. So the best alternative is actually quite a bit worse than sticking with you. So understand that. And when you are asked for a concession, and this works whether you're asking them for something or they're asking for you, there is a tool that I'm going to share with you that we created that actually helps you to have the conversation about this. So the BATNA gives you the backbone, if you like, the strength to go, I can resist this, but how do you actually have that conversation? So the model that we have here is the FAST model. It stands for frame, advance, signal, and track. And the way it works is this. I'm going to use the example of them asking for you for a concession, but it does work if you're asking for a price increase as well. So they go, I don't want to pay a 10% price increase. I could do 2%, let's say. So the first thing you have to do is to frame your initial request, whether that's the price increase you asked for or the deal that you put on the table. You have to frame it as valid, and you have to frame the request they've made as significant. You have to frame your original offer as valid, because if you don't, it will trigger aggression, the research shows, in the customer. So frame it. This is why we've done this. It's an industry standard. Here's the calculations that show it's reasonable. And then frame their request as large. So rather than going, well, 2% is still a decent price increase, you go, that's 5 times less than we were asking for, right? So you frame their request in such a way as to verbally make it seem quite a significant request. And then you pause, then you stop. And silence, as many of you know, is one of the most powerful tools in negotiation. You just pause. And what happens in that pause is people either retract their request for a concession, or they give you more information because they're uncomfortable and they want to fill the gap. If they're very well trained as a procurement, they may just be quiet too, but it's worth a go, and in 70% of the time, you'll get something back for that silence. Then, if you need to, advance options, and we'll talk about give-get trades in a second, but here, you don't just go, okay, I will make a concession, but you always try and get something back in return for the concession that you're willing to give. And ideally, you offer a couple of trades, because by doing that, you'll learn a lot about what they really care about. If you say, if you do this, I can do that, or if you do this, I can do that, the one they go for, the pairing that they go for, will tell you a lot about what they genuinely care about in the negotiation, not what they say their priorities are. Then S is for signal. You signal your walk away by not making linear concessions. So if you start at 10% asking for a price increase and they go 2, and then you go, okay, 8, and then you go 6, and then you go 4, what you're signaling is that you're going to end up at 0, because you're making consistent concessions and they will go, I know there's more to come, right? Instead, make decreasing concessions. So you go 8, 7, 6.5, 6.3, and you're signaling kind of where your walkaway point is. Even better if you use non-round numbers and anchor the conversation in the decimals. So, 10, 9.386, 8.942, and pretty clear where you're going to end up. And finally, track the gives and gets. Track the concessions that are made and what you get in return, because that kind of inoculates you against somebody reopening the conversation and the negotiation down the line. And that does happen quite a lot. So you think you've got agreement, and then suddenly the CFO's on the line, or the CPO, and they're trying to reopen the conversation. So in that, I did talk about kind of gives and gets, and let me just talk quickly about creating value, and then we'll wrap up for today and ask for some questions if you guys have any. So one of the key things you can do in dealing with procurement is to understand the interests, not just of procurement, but of all of the different stakeholders. Jonas, who I mentioned before, talks about you're the family doctor and you need to understand the whole family. And there's nothing quite as powerful when a procurement person is trying to nail you down as to go, well, yeah, but I know the chief of marketing really cares about this, and the head of finance wants that, and the CTO wants the other. They really don't have anywhere else to go because those are their internal customers. So map out what the customer cares about in some detail. That includes what their underlying needs are. So what the key performance indicators are they're trying to achieve, what their current challenges are they're trying to resolve, and what their wider goals and aspirations are. Think about the decision criteria they used when they were choosing your solution, because those also create interests for the negotiation. And so do the things you had to do to alleviate risk. And you map that out for not just the function that you normally sell to, but the other functions within the customer organization who benefit from or impacted in some way by that solution, including procurement. So you might do that for 3 or 4 or 5 different functions. It seems like a lot of work. It feels like a paper filling exercise, but believe me, if you do one thing in an important negotiation, if it's for 30 euros, don't bother. If it's for €1 million, definitely bother. And the better you can do this, the better equipped you will be to create value, but also to kind of demonstrate to procurement that you really know what you're doing, and that you have the other stakeholders on your side. So map out interests. And then I talked a bit about gives and gets. So here's the way to think about this. Some of those interests will be things that you care about more than the customer. Maybe your company needs cash, and so payment terms are a massive priority. And maybe the customer is flush with cash and it's less of an issue for them, or vice versa. Some of them are things that the customer will care about. And so what we're trying to do here is to plot on this grid the things that you care about and the things that the customer cares about. And the things that the customer cares about more than you are gives. The things that the supplier cares about more than more than the customer, are the things you want to get, right? And the things in the top right are the things that both the supplier and the customer care about are prizes. They're the things that will tend to be fought over in a more win-lose sort of a way. And so you plot on here all of the different interests that you have in the negotiation, and you find pairs of things that are potential gives, things that you care about less than the customer, and potential gets, things that they care about more than you. And essentially you're offering a trade. You go, if you could give me, if you would accept lower service levels, then I can give you better payment terms. And it's important to not make one-sided offers, but to make conditional offers and use that very specific language. If you, then I. Don't say I will if you will. Do them first. So if you, then I. And one last thought on this. When you're making a give, it's not a bad idea to make a give that is what I call a seed. So it doesn't have to be a core part of the deal. It might be a give that's something tangential, a complementary product or service, an extra bit of professional advice that they hadn't asked for, something that could turn into a bigger part of the deal down the line. So they get exposure to something that they didn't know about, and they go, well, that's actually pretty good. We'll do more of that. So use it as an opportunity to kind of share some of the other things that your company can do. So there is an hour to deal with a very complicated situation. I very much hope that's been helpful, but supply chains, inflation, the sales team, you're under a lot of pressure. You need that mindset, resilience, responsibility, so an internal locus of control, and rigor, handling difficult conversations, figure out how you're going to reduce tension and build trust quickly in the conversation, by using the AAA opening and thinking about customer justice, and then negotiating price increases. Think about how you're going to capture value and what their real alternative is to doing an agreement around that price increase, but also think about how you create value. So you might offer a price increase, but offer them something to make that more palatable and give them a win at the same time and actually create more value for everybody. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I hope that's been helpful, and I would be very happy to answer any questions at all. Just to remind you that this is a tiny, tiny part of our curriculum, which sits around the whole customer buying cycle, and our subscribers have access to all of this online in virtual training and in in-person training at any point. So you can be agile in responding to the issues in your business. The handling conversations around supply and price is an example of what we call BCIs, business critical interventions. And we're constantly creating these to add additional content to our curriculum as the economy and the market and the world of sales evolves and changes. One of the next ones that we're working on is actually thinking about how suppliers can use a form of rationing and thinking about where they allocate scarce supplies in order to optimize the future health of their business. So that one will be coming up and may become another webinar in the near future.